Chapter 13, Lecture Outline, Anatomy and Physiology. Alright, we can look at the second slide. The introduction, we're going to be looking at how many Americans are injured yearly either in sports-related accidents, automotive accidents, or even hazardous accidents, maybe on the job or around the house. But we're looking at thousands of Americans are injured yearly. The spinal cord is the information highway between the body and the brain, which will consist of, we call it the central nervous system. This consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So we're going to be looking at the spinal nerves, and you should remember that when we talked about it this past summer in 201, you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. They are grouped in what we call plexuses, and then we have your 12 cranial nerves. Alright, some of the learning outcomes in this chapter: the basic functions of the spinal cord, the microscopic and gross anatomy of the spinal cord in terms of histology and the dissection of the spinal cord, and we're going to be looking at the pathways in terms of your ascending and your descending tracts that travel impulses from the periphery into the central nervous system. Now remember from part 1, you have your dorsal root ganglion, and that's that swollen region on the nerve that brings that sensory information into the central nervous system. And then remember, once there, it has to be processed by the interneurons or the association neurons. Alright, let's look at slide number 4. When we look at some of the functions, conduction, that's the transmission of that nerve impulse either up or down the spinal cord. Now remember, sensory information travels along the ascending tracts into the spinal cord. Your motor response travels down the spinal cord. Remember, you have afferent and efferent. Afferent are the sensory fibers that bring sensory information into the central nervous system. And your efferent, these are your motor fibers that carry information out of the spinal cord. And the effector cells, that's where the motor neurons are being carried to, and the effector cells, they carry out the functions such as raising your hand off of a hot stove. Your neurointegration system, these are the ones that process the information. So they receive input from different sources, and then they're going to transmit it to the target organ. So if again you look at it, can be integrated and executed at the appropriate output, such as bladder control to avoid urination. Locomotion, these contains the central patterns or your generator cells. When you think about generators, let's go back to the action potential. And remember, you have your sodium and your potassium gates in terms of a resting membrane potential that's normally at a negative millivolts on the inside. And we have the sodium potassium ATPase pump that regulates this resting membrane potential. But in order for a cell to be excited, you have to generate an action potential. So the minimum threshold must be met in order for the cell to become excited. So this enables us to pick up things, enables us to walk. Reflexes are involuntary response based on a stimulus. So it helps us to coordinate, balance ourselves, maintain posture, and to protect our bodies from injury. Alright, the spinal cord. Again, it occupies the upper 2/3 of the vertebral canal. The inferior margin stops at L1, but you got the chordae equina of the horsetails. Now the average thickness is about 1.8 centimeters and runs about 45 centimeters in length. Now remember, we have the 31 pairs of spinal nerves that branch out of the spinal cord. Now go back to your anatomy and look at your intervertebral foramen or your transverse foramen, where the anterior and the posterior branching rami comes out to feed the anterior portion of the body and the posterior portion of the body. So you got different spinal segments that we're going to be looking at. Again, you got cervical, you can have lumbar, you can have the coccygeal. Now the thoracic is not a plexus. They are named based on their individual exon of the spinal cord from T1 down to T12. All right, when we look at the grooves on the brain, you got your longitudinal grooves and your anterior and posterior. All right, posterior median sulcus and your anterior median fissure. So you got your cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and your sacral regions of the spinal cord. On the spinal cord, you got two basic enlarged areas. The cervical spinal nerves are enlarged as well as the lumbar. The conus medullaris, these are the horsetail, or where these are the tapered ends, and the cauda equina are the horsetail or your nerve roots that branch down once you get past the second lumbar vertebrae into the fifth sacral vertebrae. All right, let's look at figure 13.1. As you can look, you can see at the upper portion of this diagram your cervical enlargement that expands from C1 down to C7. Remember, we talked about the spinal meninges, and you got your dura mater, your pia mater, and your arachnoid. You see your thoracic region, your lumbar, you see your medullary canal, your cauda equina, and you can see where you have L5 down to S5, where you got the terminal phylum or your cauda equina, your horsetail region. You can look also at the figure B, 13.1. You see the vertebrae protects the spinal cord as it travels from the foramen magnum, where it touches with the inferior portion of the brain. Alright, you see your epidural space. This is where a lot of times you give your spine injections during delivery, as well as when you're trying to do nerve blocks on patients with either sciatic type of pain or nervous type of pain. Alright, again, you can see your ribs, you see your transverse processes, you can see your body, you see the outer covering, your dura mater. Alright, meninges, these are your fibrous covering that encloses the brain and spinal cord. You heard of spinal meningitis. These are the things that can become inflamed or infected via either a bacterial or a viral infection. And the only way you can identify it is to do a spinal tap and to send it to the lab to identify what type of organism is causing this disease in order to provide proper treatment. If it's a viral infection and you treat it for bacteria, then you can lose the patient and vice versa. So we go from superficial, the outermost layer, to deep. The dura mater is the outermost covering. The inner is the arachnoid, the middle, the arachnoid matter, and the innermost layer is the pia mater. Remember now, the dura sheath, it surrounds the epidural space. And within the epidural space, you're going to have the brain and the spinal cord that's going to be bathed with what we call cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, now we can look at the arachnoid membrane. It's going to have attachment with the dura, and it acts as an intermediate layer because it separates the dura from the pia mater. But again, the cerebral spinal fluid, this is a protective fluid that provides buoyancy between the brain and the spinal cord. As a cushion, is also a chemically rich environment to bring nutrients into the brain, and also removes waste. Also, now remember, now the brain has this protective barrier that really prevents a lot of things from penetrating. So when people have like different cancers of the brain, it's hard to use chemotherapy because of the blood-brain barrier. The chemicals cannot penetrate it, so that's why a lot of times they have to go in and excise the lesions and then use radiation therapy. Now the innermost layer is the pia mater. It attaches and corresponds to the contour of the spinal cord, and it's going to be continuous all the way down to the terminal phylum. And also you have your coccygeal ligaments, and remember, ligaments are these attachments from bone to bone. Alright, let's look at figure 13.28. Remember, from your anatomy, you see your spinous processes, you see the body of the vertebrae, you see your central canal that contains the spinal cord. Now remember that with the spinal cord, you see your gray matters that's surrounded by the white matter. You see the dura mater is the outermost layer, the arachnoid matter middle, and the innermost layer is the pia mater. you see your transverse foramen or the interforamen spacing that your spinal nerves come out. You see your posterior root ganglion. This brings the sensory information from the periphery into the central nervous system where it forms a synapse. Now remember, a synapse is when two body parts come together and they stimulate the impulse to carry the information on into the spinal cord. And they're going to go in by way of the posterior horn of the spinal cord in order for this process to take place. So again, you can see how the spinal cord is really being protected by the vertebrae. All right, so you see your spinal nerves, you see the body, you see your vertebral foramen on both sides, and you see the spinal processes. Now, as you can see, this process is bifurcated, so that lets you know you're up in the cervical region of the body. All right, this is spinal bifida, a fetal defect. You can see how the spinal cord is on the external surface of the body. So the vertebrae fail to form a complete vertebral arch, and this number occurs out of 1,000 births. All right, so the most complicated and the most deadly form is spina bifida cystica. Now, a lot of times this is due to folic acid or a B vitamin deficiency. So if we can identify it earlier, now we can add it. All right. So again, if you add it early on into the diet for all women of childbearing years, it reduces the risk. Normally, about the 4th week of development, this is when you begin to see the congenital defect to occur. All right, let's look at the cross section of the spinal cord on figure 13, point 2B and C. Again, remember, in the spinal cord, the white matter surrounds the gray matter. Now, we'll see this different when we get to the brain. The gray matter will surround the white matter. You see your central canal, you see your posterior median sulcus, but in the front it's called a median fissure. It's a lot larger. All right. You see your posterior horn, that forms a synapse with the posterior root ganglion, bringing the sensory information into the spinal cord by what we call the afferent sensory neuron. Now again, you see your anterior horn. This is where a lot of your skeletal muscle information comes out in terms of the motor response. A lot, when you look at the lateral horns or lateral column, this supplies mainly the glands of the body. So again, the white matter is highly myelinated, where the gray matter is mainly little or unmyelinated cells. So the impulses travel, remember, much faster on the myelinated nerve fibers. And again, we're dealing with the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. All right, here you can see ascending and descending. The reddish is ascending. That means that information is coming into from the periphery, forms a synapse from the posterior root ganglion with the posterior horn. Then it interacts with the inner neurons or the association neuron. There it processes it. It's almost like a switchboard. It determines what about in the brain that impulse is going to travel in order to get a motor response that comes down by way of the green tracks to the exterior out of the spinal cord, either by way of the anterior horns or the lateral horns. Now, if you see, the lateral horns are visible from your second thoracic vertebrae down to your lumbar one. Now, remember the central nervous system. The body can be broken down in terms of the autonomic nervous system that has both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. Sympathetic, these are fight or flight for dangerous, active type of situations. Parasympathetic is for calming. So parasympathetic calms you down. Sympathetic speeds you up. If you look at the horns, the gray commensurate, it forms a connection between both sides of the spinal cord, left and right. Your anterior root, they carry motor responses down. When you look at the posterior dorsal root, they carry sensory fibers, all right, and they pair with the anterior ventral horns of the body. All right, look at the inferior portion where you see posterior spinal cerebellar tract, or where it says lateral reticulospinal tract. Well, the names of these tracts are telling you where they originate and where they terminate. So the anterior spinal cerebellum, it forms a synapse in the anterior end of the spinal cord, and it travels to the cerebellum, which is that posterior inferior aspect of the brain, that cauliflower component that we find inferior to the cerebral hemisphere. Alright, you got columns of funiculi. These are bundles of white matter, okay? You're going to have both upper and lower. Alright, so your posterior, remember, is dorsal, anterior is front, ventral is front, and post-dorsal is back. So again, the tracts of fasciculi, they are subdivided into their what? Columns, exactly. So again, they transmit the impulses up or down the spinal cord. Alright, ascending carries sensory information up to the brain. Descending brings a motor response back. Decussation means that if the impulse starts on the right side, the response can be carried out on the left side and vice versa. Contralateral, when the origin and destination of the tract both are on opposite sides of the body. Ipsilateral, the origination and destination is on the same side. So that means the impulse does not cross over. So again, we think about the cross reflex theory. If you step on a soft object with your right foot, that causes a response in order for you to raise your right foot off the ground. But before you can raise it up off the ground, which means the impulse is contralateral, it has to decussate in order for you to extend the left foot to keep your balance. Alright, ascending, we talked about carrying sensory information up the spinal column. You got first, second, and third order neurons. It's almost like a track meet where you're going to be passing the baton. Your first order, it detects the stimulus from the exterior. It's going to transmit that impulse into the spinal cord, where it's going to form a first neuronal synapse. Now, the second order neuron is once it forms that first order neuronal synapse, it begins to either decussate, cross over, or it stays on the same side, but it's going to travel up. Now it's going to form a synapse with what we call the second order neuron, and it's going to carry the impulse up through the thalamus. Now the thalamus is that gateway to the cerebral hemispheres. So 90% of all sensory information must travel through the thalamus to get to the upper brain centers. Now your third order of transmitting or transferring this synapse information, the third order, they're going to carry it up to the cerebral cortex that are both right and left, and there you're going to have your different lobes, your frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And it's going to process it there, and then it's going to send a motor response down on your descending tracts. Alright, let's look at figure 13.5a. You see gracilis, fasciculus, and your cunnate fasciculus. You see your spinal thalamic tract and your spinal reticular tract. Again, if you see spinal thalamic, it starts in the spinal cord and it's going to terminate through the thalamic area. The spinal reticular, it goes through the spinal cord up through into the reticular fibers of your cerebral hemisphere. Alright, so let's look at figure A. You see the receptors, they pick up the stimulus in that little red arrow. It goes into the spinal cord by way of your spinal nerve. You see that little swollen area? That's your posterior ganglion. It forms a synapse there and carries it on into the spinal cord, into the posterior horn. Alright, there forms that first order neuron synapse. It goes up through the medulla. When you see your gracilis nucleus, there forms a synapse. It decussates and crosses over where you see the medial lemniscus. Now it's moved to the opposite side. Now you form your second order neuron, and it travels on up through the medial lemniscus till you get to the thalamus. Here, the thalamus, you form your third order connection, and that carries it on up into the somatostatic cortex or the somatosensory region in order to be processed. Now, this is all ascending, so this deals with all of your sensory information that's traveling up the spinal cord. So you see, you go through the thalamic, the spinal thalamic tract, up into the reticular fibers of the spinal cord. Okay, when you look at gracilis fasciculus, you look at signals that are going to be carried from the mid-thoracic and the lower parts. And remember T12, you got T1 through T6, then T6 through T12. So below T6 or above T6, again, at T6 and above, you have the cunate fasciculus, all right? They consist of your first order neurons, and they travel ipsilateral. That means they're still on the same side. There they can terminate with the gracilis nucleus in the medulla oblongata, and it carries signals for pain. Viscera is your organ, but you can't feel the organ, so it's going to be referred to it as referred pain. So let's say you have kidney pain, you have lower back pain, or when people say, oh, I'm having a heart attack, they don't feel the heart. They get pain radiating in the chest or down the arm. Vibrations. Proprioception is body position in space. And what I mean by that is if I close my eyes and if I say raise your right hand, you don't have to look to see that your right hand is raised because you know just by the perception of the body. Or if you pick up an orange or an apple based on the texture, you know what it means. So it's body position in space. Let's look at the cunate fasciculus. Here at T6 or above, it carries the fasciculus occupies the lateral half or lateral portion of the posterior column. Alright, so it pushes the gracilis fasciculus medially. So they have fibers that will terminate in the cunate nucleus or on the ipsilateral side of the medulla oblongata. Your third order neurons, they're going to go from the thalamus on up into the cerebral hemisphere on the third order neuron. Alright? Remember, the second order neuron crosses over at the medial-lemniscus pathway in order for the left hemisphere processing the stimuli, but it's going to be on the opposite side of the body, such as the right side. Alright, let's look at the spinothalamic tract. Here, you have anterior, lateral, that passes up the anterior and the lateral side of the spinal cord. The spinothalamic tract deals with sensations such as hot, cold, light touch, if tickle or itch, pain, and pressure. Alright, the tract is made up of axons that deal with the second order neurons that forms a synapse with the first order coming in from the periphery and synapsing in the spinal cord. Alright, so here the third order neurons will continue up through the cerebral cortex where it forms a synapse at the thalamic region. So again, the tracts by name carry specific sensations. So as you learn chapter 12 and as we go through it, 13, you will see that the different tracts carry different specific functions. Hot, cold, tickle, itch, pain, pressure, vibration, things of this nature. Alright, the spinal reticular tract, again, it carries pain signals based on injured or body tissue. They can extend up into the reticular formation. Again, it has gray matter in the medulla oblongata and pons. So they also continue from the pons to the thalamus, and then there it can travel on up to the cerebral cortex. So again, the spinal reticular tract, it goes up the front and lateral portion of the body tract. So it deals with strictly pain signals. Alright, so now let's look at the spinal cerebellar tract. Here it travels anterior and posterior. Again, we traveling through the lateral columns. It carries proprioceptive signals from the limbs and trunk up to the cerebellum. Now remember the cerebellum, if you look at your diagram of the brain, you got your cerebral hemisphere that makes up majority of the brain. Inferior to the hemispheres on the posterior end that sits down in the occipital lobe, you will find the cerebellum or the cauliflower, okay? So that's what it travels to, from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. Alright, so it has axons that deals with your second order neurons. Now the first order neurons, they originate in the muscles and your tendons, alright? So they're going to end in the posterior horn coming from the muscles in the periphery. into, by way of the dorsal root ganglion, into the posterior horn. There forms a synapse with this spinal cerebellar tract. Alright, so it's going to go to the cerebellum, providing it with feedback to coordinate movement. Now remember, the cerebellum mainly job is posture, balance, movement. Now the posterior cerebellar tract, it stays ipsilateral. Okay, now the anterior cerebellar tract, it can decussate, so it crosses over as it moves up the opposite side. But the cross back to the ends in the ipsilateral aspect of the cerebellum. So again, contralateral impulses, it starts on that side and it can travel on that same side where you're going to get the response. But it can decussate to the opposite side in order to get the opposite side to carry out a specific function. Alright, when we talk about descending tracts, again, we're carrying the motor response to the sense response back down. Alright, so again, it involves the upper motor neurons and your lower motor neurons. The upper motor neurons, they originate in the cerebral cortex or the brain stem, and they end somewhere down in the lower motor neuron area. So the lower motor neurons, they go from the soma, the cell body, in the brain stem or the spinal cord. So you can see your cerebral peduncles on the right hand side. You see your cerebellum, you see your midbrain, you see your medulla, you see your spinal cord, and you can see how it X's out of the anterior horn when you look at your lower motor neurons. Alright, your cortical spinal tract, it carries information on fine coordinated movement, like either picking up a scalpel blade or a pencil to write with. So you got your pyramids again on the ridges associated with the front surface of the medulla oblongata. Most of these fibers, they can decussate into the lower medulla, forming the lateral cortical spinal tract. Some of them can terminate in terms of the anterior cortical spinal tract that descends into the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord. So they control the contralateral muscle interaction. Tectospinal tract, again, reflex turning the head. So if you hear a loud noise or hear something, your head automatically turns to the direction of the sound in order, if it's a dangerous situation, to get out of harm's way. Your lateral ones, again, they originate up in the reticular formation of the cerebral cortexes, and they control our muscle interaction in the lower and upper limbs, mainly our posture and balance. Okay, they also contain descending analgesic pathways, and remember, analgesic is something that helps to alleviate pain. The lateral and medial vestibulospinal tract, again, they receive impulses for balances from the inner ear. So they deal with cross-extensor muscles and limbs for balance. When I gave the example, if you step on something on the right foot, you got to flex that foot, but the left leg, it has to extend to maintain your posture and balance. Alright, the spinal nerves. This is just some examples of our learning outcomes. Again, know the anatomy of the nerves, what's the role of the ganglia, trace the branches of your spinal nerves. You need to know the 5 plexus that makes up the group of nerves in that region, and the dermatomes of the spinal nerves. Alright, again, the gross anatomy of the nerve. You can see the epineuron, the outermost layer of the nerve fibers. You see that. You can see your endoneuron that looks at the individual fiber, and the perineuron, it looks like at a fascicle bundle. You can also see your arteries and veins, which are the blue and the red vessels, intermingle within the spinal nerve. Alright, again, 3 parts of a neuron. You got the soma, which is the body. You got the dendrites, and you have the axons. Nerves can be the purely sensory, purely motor, or mixed. And we did talk about that last semester in 201 in terms of our 12 pair cranial nerves. So again, before class on Wednesday, please review your 12 pericranial nerves. Alright, Schwann cells or neurolema. Schwann cells are these fibers covering around the nerves to insulate them. So that speeds up conduction. Interneurons, they are loose connective tissue on the entire nerve cell neurolema. Perineuron, they look at an individual fascicle, and the epineuron, they look at the individual nerve itself. And then I remember I showed you where the blood vessels penetrate the connective tissue covering in order to bring nutrients in and to remove waste. Alright, poliomyelitis, again, this is a viral infection that affects the motor neuron cells in the brain stem. It can cause paralysis, shrinking of the muscle or atrophy, and respiratory arrest. So poliomyelitis goes untreated can be dangerous and a life-threatening situation. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Now remember, sclerosis means scarring or hardening. Just like you have arteriosclerotic diseases, thickening, narrowing of the blood vessels. So again, when you damage the motor neuron, that muscle can atrophy or shrink. Scarring can occur. Now, one of the ganglion cells is the astrocytes. This forms a blood connection between the nerve and the capillaries in that region. So these cells fail to reabsorb your glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter that can be toxic to the nerve cells, and they can damage those nerve cells, causing muscle weakness, paralysis, causing affecting your speaking, swallowing, and the use of hands. So again, in sensory and intellectual functions, they do remain unaffected with this process. So let's look at table 13.2. We talked about afferent, they bring sensory information in. Efferent motor responses are carried out. Okay, again, sensory, afferent, they carry sensory information into the central nervous system. Motor, efferent, carries it out. Mixed, that means it consists of both motor and sensory, and they're going to carry that to the effector cell that carries out the response. Both sensory and motor can be broken down into somatic or visceral or general or special. Alright, general is pretty much any type of body sensation. Specific or special, like taste, smell, sight, hearing, from that standpoint. So I recommend that you go through table 13.2 and kind of go through the nerve and its functions. Alright, ganglion, again, we talked about that swollen region inside of the nerve cell. You see your little sensory neurons inside. You see your spinal nerve, the outer epineuron there. You see your motor nerve fiber. So a ganglion is just a cluster of neurosomes outside the central nervous system that has to be transmitted and carried into the spinal cord, and where it forms that first neuron synapse, or first order synapse. Alright, the spinal nerves, you remember you got 31 pairs of spinal nerves that are mixed. You got 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. So again, the plexus is your cervical, your lumbar, your sacral, and your coccygeal. Thoracic is technically not a plexus, but it is named based on the level of the spinal nerve in which they exit the spinal cord, such as T1, T2, etc. Alright, posterior root is the sensory input into the central nervous system. Anterior, that carries the motor response out. Cauda equina, the horsetail root, they go from L2 down to the coccygeal C1. Alright, let's look at figure 13.35. We can kind of look at the vertebral atlas and axis, C1 and C2 for yes and no. Cervical plexus from C1 through C5. Remember, C5 is for your phrenic nerve. That's the one that mainly controls the breathing of the diaphragm. You see your medullary column. You see your coccygeal C1. You see the cauda equina. And these spinal hairs or neuroroots, they go all the way down to the coccygeal or the sacrum, and you can see where you got the sciatic nerve, most on the inferior or the posterior aspect of your ischium and the posterior aspect of the coccygeal, where you get the side pain running down from the buttocks down either side of the right or lower leg. Now remember, your large areas are the cervical as well as the lumbar region. Alright, anterior ramus, they give rise to the intercostal nerve that comes through the intercostal spaces. They take care of the anterior aspect of the chest and trunk. Posterior, it takes place of the dorsal or the back portion of the back. Again, your meningeal branches from the vertebral canal. You got your dura mater, your pia mater, and your arachnoid, and they base the spinal cord with the cerebrospinal fluid. Alright, figure 1337, you see where you got another figure of the spinal nerves. You see your transverse processes, you see the body, you see the central canal. Alright, this is a gross anatomy of the spinal cord, where you can see how large the columns are. You see your C5 segment. You can see the dura mater, the arachnoid. Remember, it's the middle and the pia, the innermost layer. You see your rootlets that are coming off, and you can see your spinal nerve number 3 off of the cervical C4 region. Alright, again, you can look at your anterior root of your rami that is branching through the intercostal margins. Alright, let's look at our nerve plexus. Again, you got your anterior rami, cervical, C1 through C5, phrenic, the diaphragm, your brachial plexus. These are the ones that branch at the neck. They go under the clavicle into the armpit, C1 down to T1. So they take care of the shoulder and the neck. So the median nerve, that's the one that affects carpal tunnel. When the retinaculum in the wrist is too tight, you get that radiating pain. Lumbar, the lower back, the genitalia, the abdominal wall, and the front portion of the thigh, L1 to L4. Sacral, it goes from L4 to S4, and coccygeal, it takes care of the S4 down through the coccygeal C1. Alright, so somatosensory, again, nerve implexes for joints, muscles, skin, proprioception of body position and space. They terminate in muscles, tendons, and joints. Motor stimulates skeletal muscle contraction. Alright, shingles, again, is a virus. If you got chicken pox, the virus tends to remain from childhood into adulthood. So the causative agent is Bacillus zoster virus, okay? And it can cause these harsh, bad rashes that follow the nerve roots of cells. The viruses. Okay, again, we look at the shingles virus or the herpes zoster virus. This is going to be a localized disease caused by a virus that follows the pathway of the body's sensory nerves. That's how it can remain dormant. So again, it travels the fast axonal transport that we talked about last chapter. It's common in people 50 or older. Discoloration, fluid filled, painful vesicles that follow the path of the nerves. So again, the chickenpox vaccine does not reduce the risk of an adult getting shingles. And a lot of times, it's a stress-related incident that brings on this complication. Alright, again, your cervical plexus, again, C1 through C5. Learn the nerves. Alright, your C1 is hypoglossal. Well, C1 interacts with hypoglossal, which is cranial nerve number 12. C2, lesser and greater auricular nerves. C3 is your transverse cervical. C5, phrenic. You can see how they loop and they're all interconnected. So an upper fracture in your vertebrae can cause total paralysis in the lower extremity. This is your brachial plexus that looks in the hand. Okay, this is a diagram of your brachial. As I mentioned earlier, you can see how the cervical plexus branches under the clavicle and goes down into the forearm, and into the palm where the digit. And the median nerve, you can see the radius is lateral. The ulnar is medial to the little finger, and the median nerve runs in the middle, both the ulnar and the radial nerve. And that's the one that becomes entrapped and it causes pain with carpal tunnel. So axillary, you see your radial, you see your medial, the musculoskeletal, musculocutaneous, they branch to the superficial aspect of the upper torso. Right, this is just a gross anatomy view of the nerves in the brachial plexus on a cadaver. So please review your nerves again. I know we covered them in 201, but let's do a quick review before class. All right, these are your lumbar. You can see them going over the ilium down past the os coccyx into the lower extremity. You see your sciatic nerve, your femoral nerve. It follows the femoral artery and vein. You see your inguinal nerve, your iliohypogastric, lateral femoral, cutaneous. Obturator nerve goes to the obturator foramen. And then you can see how they branch down to the dorsal aspect of the foot and posterior. All right, your sacral again, L4 through your coccygeum. All right, your sciatic nerve, you can see it is a combination of your fibular nerve and your tibia. So the sciatic nerve is made up of these two nerves combined. All right, nerve injuries, you can have radial nerve injury as it goes through the axillary under the armpit. Crutch paralysis, when people wear crutches and they're not cushioned and the pressure in the upper arm pushing down on it. That's why you see sometimes with people with a towel there, because it can cause paralysis or what we call wrist drop. Sciatic pain, it travels down the gluteal region down to the lower leg. All right. Sometimes it can be a herniation of the intervertebral disc or through osteoporosis or narrowing and thinning of the bone in the spinal cord. Dermatomes, these are areas on the skin that reflect back to the spinal cord. Remember now, you can't unzip a body to look at C1 or T1, T2. So we have this map on our body that we can touch, tickle, itch, pain, and they go to the actual site root in the body to let you know that that nerve is functioning properly. So kind of learn what C2, C8, L1, S1 is located. All right, reflexes again, coming up toward the end. We got our spinal reflexes, our reflex arches, somatic or our body reflexes. Here again, reflexes are quick, involuntary. When they say stereotype, that means if I use the same stimulus, I should get the same type of response. So they're quick, involuntary. The interneurons and your synaptic delay occurs. A lot of times if you stump your toe in the middle of the night, there's like a millisecond between that, you know you did it, and when the pain comes. Reflexes are involuntary, that your body responds either contracting itself or picking itself up off of that harmful object. Reflexes, again, glandular secretions. I don't know if you ever cut up an onion, but you get that immediate response of tearing. That flushes the chemicals out of your eye that came from the onions itself. Somatic, again, involves body parts moving, such as the skeletal muscle, for you to contract a leg or to move out of harm's way. Afferent, again, they carry sensory information from the periphery into the spinal cord, integrating association of interneurons. They process it to send it to the appropriate regions in the upper brain. Efferent is the motor response that carries it down to the effector cells, and the effector cell could be if I put my right hand on a hot object, so it feels hot. That's sensory. It goes into the central nervous system. It tells my brain to process it, so that lets me know my right hand is on a hot object. I'm going to contract. That's that motor response going to my biceps or my triceps in order for me to contract that muscle to pick it up off of the hot stove. So the effector will be my muscles in my arm that will contract. The same thing with the knee-jerk reflex. Effector cells, you're going to have cross-extensor reflexes, because for one to extend, the other one has to flex. So remember, we got synergistic, we got antagonistic, and we got our primary muscle movers. Antagonistic means that's a muscle that opposes the action of another one. All right, we talked about proprioception, muscle spindles. These are stress receptors that enable skeletal muscles in a group to interact, to move things, to help maintain posture, balance, coordinate movement. Here you're going to see your Golgi tendon apparatuses, or your intrafiber muscle fibers that would integrate the muscle and the tendon, because remember, tendons attach muscle to bone. So if I go to lift up an object too heavy, that sends an impulse to my muscles, to my tendon, to say this is too much of a load, you need to drop it, or else you can cause an avulsion fracture or the rupture of the tendon away from the bone. Alright, muscle spindles again, 7 to 8. Your intrafusal muscles that are there. Rest of the muscles are generating forces are the extrafusal muscle fibers. So again, primary afferent, they monitor the length and speed of change. Alright, and the secondary afferent, they monitor just the length only of the muscles. So your gamma, they innervate the ends of the intramuscular fibers to keep it in taut. So you got your alpha motor neurons, they interact with the extrafusal muscle fibers that consist of the remaining muscle fiber cells. Alright, again, the stretch, they help to maintain equilibrium, stabilize balance. Again, they're mediated mainly by the brain and the spinal cord components. So again, if the muscle is certainly stretched by a tendon tap, that causes the need to jerk. Alright, tension-somatic reflexes help to diagnose muscle diseases. Okay, again, your reflex phenomenon that prevents muscles from working against each other. This is called reciprocal inhibition. Alright, learn figure 13, slide 13.60 on figure 13.22. So let's go. Number one, you tap the patellar tendon or ligament. That's gonna excite the quadriceps femoris. It stimulates a stretch signal that goes into the spinal cord via the posterior root ganglion. There, it forms a synapse. The efferent signals is the alpha neurons, or the alpha motor neurons. They stimulate the quadriceps to contract, causing the need to jerk. At the same time, you stimulate the inhibitory muscle fibers to cut them off. So that allows the neuron to inhibit the alpha motor neurons on the opposite side of the hamstring. So that allows the quads to contract while the hamstrings or the knee flexors are turned off. And they, remember, the hamstrings are antagonistic to the quads and vice versa. Alright, this is what I call the flexural draw reflex. If you step on a hot object, you send a signal up. If you step on a sharp object, you're going to send a signal up the spinal cord. It has to cross over because the right side that you stepped on is ipsilateral, it flexes, but the opposite side has to extend to be excited in order to keep you to maintain your balance. Alright, so that's just the cross extensor continuation of that process. Alright, again, we did talk about the tendon organ reflexes of the Golgi tendon. They can inhibit muscles from contracting too strongly to cut down on tearing of the tendons. Alright, spinal cord trauma, about 10 to 12,000 of people are paralyzed a year. 16 to 30 are the age group at risk, and 50% of these occur through motorcycles. Alright, this is going to conclude pretty much the remaining part of this lecture. Paraplegic paralysis on both legs. Alright, quadriplegic, all quadrants are paralyzed. Hemiplegic, one side. Paresis is partial paralysis or weakness, just weakness now of that particular region. Alright, that concludes chapter 13 lecture. Please, if you have any questions, let's discuss them in class on Wednesday night.